chance to meet him, which would have been wonderful.
Right.
Okay.
Once again, how important was he for anime?
Osamu Tezuka was absolutely vital in the history of anime. I think that there would have been still a strong anime industry without him, but it would have had a very different shape, and its creativity would have moved in quite different directions. Because what he did was he trained an entire generation of Japanese animators and inspired many, many more. It's very difficult to work in either Japanese comics or Japanese animation without taking Tezuka into account, because you are either influenced by him or reacting against his influence. The great Hayao Miyazaki, who made Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, said that he saw Tezuka as an older brother whose influence he constantly had to fight to make his own form of art. So he really is the key figure. It's like imagining the history of Western music without the Beatles. It would still be there, but it would look different, and he is as important as that. I think he's the most important figure in Japanese popular culture in the 20th century, because all the people that he trained went on to found studios and to direct and to work in animation. All the people that he inspired are now feeding into animation. And there are so many major influential figures who were taught by him, who read their first comic book by him, who had their first job from him. Leaving aside his own enormous creativity, I mean, over 700 animated titles, and that's only one aspect of his work. He really was the foundation stone of the modern anime industry.
From an international perspective, how important has Astro Boy been?
From an international perspective in Asia, very important indeed. In the West, possibly less so. He was very influential in America, but many people didn't really register that he was Japanese and took him as another American cartoon figure. But I would say that his main influence has been in showing what a vast audience you can create for shows that ask serious questions in a way that can be understood by children. And at its core, many of us believe that Astro Boy is about discrimination, because robots in it are second-class citizens. And even though Astro is a perfectly good, perfectly innocent, sweet figure, embodied as a child, so someone we should all protect, he is consistently discriminated against, abused and tortured by humans. So there's that constant issue that's always there and always underlying it. And children understand this very well, because children understand injustice from a very early age, and children understand powerlessness and abuse of power from a very early age. So I think in that sense, it's one of the pioneering shows for conveying big moral ideas without preaching.
You mentioned earlier on the inspiration from Hanna-Barbera, for example. How can that be seen in Astro Boy?
Well, it was very influential in terms of the way Tezuka designed his characters. From the Fleischers, from Hanna-Barbera, from Disney, he acquired a soft, rounded line and a way of drawing characters with big eyes and with very simplified faces. That obviously makes animation much easier, because the simpler a figure is, the simpler a face is, the cheaper and the faster it is to animate. So that was a major influence. Stylistically, I don't think Hanna-Barbera particularly was that big an influence on his art. I think that the stylistic influence came very strongly from Disney, but just as strongly from the European animators that he admired. But in terms of timing, in terms of setting and composing shots, I think Hanna-Barbera and the Fleischers were quite influential.
Great. Can I ask you about Ghost in the Shell?
Oh my, there's a franchise.
Describe the film, please.
Well, Ghost in the Shell is essentially another movie about robots and moral dilemmas. The Japanese have engaged with robots in ways that no other nation in the world has engaged. They're largely accepted and embraced there as partners and helps to mankind. But there is this constant question that they engage with very thoroughly about when consciousness becomes personhood, when sentience entitles someone or something to be considered a person. And what Ghost in the Shell does is it sets in a very contemporary, very acceptable, very accessible world this question of what does it mean to be human? If your body is augmented and your mind is augmented by all these cyber parts, how much of you is still human and how much of you has become a new form of life? Is cybernetics and robotics the next stage of human evolution? And what happens to the humans who are left behind? You could almost make an analogy with the arrival of Cro-Magnon man and the Neanderthals as different types of human, new types of human, what David Bowie called Homo superior, flood in. What happens to the humans who are not modified? What happens to the humans who are not upgraded? At the moment, ordinary human man is alpha predator. But we see in Ghost in the Shell very clearly that Kusanagi and her enhanced cops are rapidly becoming the alpha predators. For the moment, they're working for us and fighting on our side. But the unanswered question is always, what happens when that species evolves beyond human? And Ghost in the Shell is a wonderful exploration of that. The original manga by Masamune Shirow, who is fascinated by all forms of science and scientific progression, but also by philosophy, sets those questions in the form of a very, very long comic book, packed with fascinating episodes. When you say philosophy, people tend to think it's dull, but his philosophy is philosophy shown through action, and that is quite remarkable. And what the movies do, and what the TV series do for Ghost in the Shell, is they take Shirow's philosophy and they put it into, as it were, bite-sized chunks, still very interesting, very intelligent and very dense, but backed with these wonderful kinetic images and some of the most marvelous cinematography. The Ghost in the Shell is now 15 years old, 16 years old, showing its age certainly, but it still holds up very, very well against contemporary animation. It had a high definition release a few years back, and that obviously enhanced the image, but the animation itself still stands on its own 2 feet with much, much younger animation. It's still an incredible movie.
Can you put the finger on why it's been important and influence?
I think it's been important because it was one of those bridge breakthrough movies in the West, and importance for us, remember, is not necessarily the same as importance for Japan, because they've got this medium. It's not remarkable to them. Individual movies are remarkable, but only in the same way that, say, an individual new Quentin Tarantino would be remarkable to a Western audience. The fact that these movies are done in animation is nothing remarkable in Japan at all. But its influence, I think, for me and from my perspective, is that when Ghost in the Shell came out, there hadn't been so many movies that really showcased the ability of anime to compete with mainstream blockbuster live-action film. Akira, obviously, won. Ghost in the Shell was the second, and that made it enormously important and makes its influence impossible to overestimate.
You were pretty much mentioning it right now, but what was new about it?
What was new about it for us as audiences? What was new about it for us was that someone would make a major science fiction blockbuster in animation, apart from Akira, which also, of course, comes from Japan. That had hardly been seen in the West. But what was new about it for the Japanese was, I think, just the scale of the vision and the way that Mamoru Oshii, Shirow's chosen director, brought the world to the screen and brought it to life. When you're adapting a much-loved comic book or novel, anything adapted from another medium, the question is always, how well is it going to be done? In Stieg Larsson's trilogy, when that was adapted for film for Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the question all his fans were asking was, how is this going to work? And of course it worked beautifully. In my opinion, the Scandinavian versions work better than the Western version with Daniel Craig, but it adapted magnificently because the people adapting it did so with love and with respect, but also with the intention of taking it into a new medium and making it afresh. And that was the same thing with Ghost in the Shell. The Japanese fans of the comic and those in the West who loved the comic were saying to themselves, will this come across on screen with the same qualities that we love? And the director and the crew remade it respecting the original spirit and keeping the original spirit, but making it absolutely a movie, not a comic book, not just a run of comic book pictures photographed, but something that took advantage of the medium and the technology of the medium to go into areas that the comic book hadn't been able to. Colour, light, sound, all the things that cinema does for our dreams that we have to map ourselves onto comic books. The crew did for Ghost in the Shell, and that was breathtaking.
Can you point out any other directors or filmmakers in the world that were obviously inspired by it?
I'm ashamed to admit I don't really follow that much Western film, but there are a huge number of directors who are said to have been inspired by it, and quite a few Western fans get cross and jump up and down and point the finger and say they're stealing from Ghost in the Shell. I don't think so. I think that the directors who've been inspired by it are inspired in the same way that all artists are inspired by other things going around. But James Cameron, for instance, has talked about it with great respect. Christopher Nolan has talked about it with great respect, and I think that that's a really serious study for which you need to talk to a film scholar rather than someone who just goes to the movies. But I know that a good many directors have mentioned it with love and with admiration.
When we go to Japan, we're going to meet the director, Oshii.
Oshii Sensei, yes.
What's so good about him?
What's so good about him? I mean, what's so good about any director? That's a difficult question.
Or how would you comment on him?
Oshii has always had a very individual vision. Even when he was working in TV animation and working on mass-produced franchises from other people's work, Oshii has always brought individual quirks to them. And the two things that I really love about his work are his...
I was doing things like that. I do quite a lot of stuff from...
The two things that I really love about Oshii are his wonderful sense of fantasy. Talk to him, if you get the chance, about a movie he directed for the Urusei Yatsura franchise, Rumiko Takahashi's comic book, which is the best piece of science fiction that was ever included in that series. Ask him about his Urusei Yatsura movie and see what he has to say. He brings a personal fantasy, a personal way of looking at the world that he works into everything he does. And that's one of his unique things. And the other is he has a wonderful sense of space, not just of using space. He has a wonderful sense of space, not just in the sense of using space in the vertical plane or through a proscenium arch, as many directors do, but in the sense of using space in the round. He considers space in all its aspects. Height, width, depth, flow through space. He's very strong on diagonals. If you look at how he composes his frames, he will very often have interesting things floating through the air in the background or moving in the air in the background. So he always gives you the sense of being in a fully realized three-dimensional bucket of air. Whereas an awful lot of filmmakers treat the screen as a flat picture, Oshii treats the screen as almost a fish tank. And we, or his characters, are the fish and looking in at them. And those two things, I think, make him a very interesting director.
Do you have a favorite scene in it, or important scene?
A favorite scene in Ghost in the Shell? I think the scene that everybody thinks of is the scene quite early in the film where Major Kusanagi, who's the central character, falls backwards off a skyscraper into an enormous well between buildings, and that is just a breathtaking spatial experience. It turns any screen into an IMAX because you are carried down, your eye is carried down with her on her downward flight. But what I find the most interesting scene is one where she is sitting on a boat talking to Bato, her number 2 and her long-time friend and lieutenant, about skin diving, about why she dives. Because if you think about it, she's a cyborg. She has a very heavy body. Diving is always a risk. What happens if she loses consciousness and sinks to the bottom? What happens if something goes wrong with her equipment? If she sinks into Hong Kong Bay, it's going to be very expensive indeed to retrieve her. So why does she dive? And talking to Bato about that, you not only see a lot of the philosophy of the film, but also the relationship between them developing really beautifully.
Have you seen The Matrix?
Yes, I love The Matrix.
Is there a connection here?
I don't know.
Or an influence?
I have no idea. I mean, really, you'd have to ask the filmmakers of The Matrix if there's an influence. But, you know, how do you actually avoid being influenced? I mean, if you're a filmmaker or you're an artist or you're a dancer, obviously you're going to be aware of everything else going on in your world. How do you shut that out of your mind when your own creative process starts? I think consciously there are people who would say, yes, Fellini influences me. I worship at the shrine of Hayao Miyazaki. I absolutely adore the work of Herzog. And they're conscious of that influence and they're constantly asking themselves, so how would he do it? How would she approach this film? How can I embody the things I admire? But also there is the unconscious influence. There's that primordial soup that we all float in. We cannot avoid the influences of the others working in our field and the others working in our culture. So is there an influence? Yes, I'm sure there is. Could you put your finger on it frame by frame? Possibly, but you'd need to make quite an extensive study of it. Because the one thing that any artist who does their work well can guarantee is that unless they want you to see their sources, you will really have to go digging for them.
What did it do for animated films?
What did it do for animated films? In what sense?
Well, Followers, was it an obvious door opener in any way? Or
I don't know. I mean, in anime, no. Because anime already had a really well-established film industry. You have to realize that while we say Ghost in the Shell, gosh wow, the Japanese say Ghost in the Shell, gosh wow, but they say that about 20, 30, 40, 60 other films in any given year. So it wasn't a game changer, I think, in Japan. It was very, very important, but it didn't take the industry in any new or different directions from where it was already going. It inspired a lot of people, but it didn't turn everything on its head and change things in quite the way Akira did. In my opinion, you may find other people who say differently. Was it a game changer in the West? I think it would be very difficult to argue that movies like Ghost in the Shell didn't have some influence on Avatar, on the creation of the world of Avatar, but Ghost in the Shell wouldn't be the only one. I'm sure it has worked its way into the DNA of lots of movies because it's a great movie. But specifically, again, I don't think in the West it was a game changer. We're very prone to overhype things. We say, oh, this is the greatest ever, this will change everything, this will alter the way you look at movies. Really, that's just PR. And as movie scholars, and even as movie lovers, I think we should be a little bit skeptical and say, good, but will it change the game? Come back to me in 10 years and maybe we'll know.
how about this other film, which I cannot quite pronounce the beginning of?
Kaze no Tane no Nausicaa, Nausicaa of the Valley of Wind.
How important was that?
That was enormous because that was the first feature film of the work of Hayao Miyazaki. And Miyazaki is now, of course, a tremendously influential filmmaker who's revered all around the world. But back then, he'd made only one other movie, and that was The Castle of Cagliostro. Fabulous movie, but based on work by another artist, not by himself. So Nausicaa was a very personal piece of work, and it was also based on one of the most popular manga in Japan, his own manga, at the time. And so it was key. But the other thing about Nausicaa was that it established a whole range of benchmarks for technique, for quality, for storytelling, that the movie industry in Japan wasn't strange to. You know, they were already there. Japanese cinematic animation was of very high quality, but it took them in some interesting directions. Nausicaa was unashamedly aimed at what you might call the Lord of the Rings crowd. The older, not children, but the older cinema-going audience, the intelligent, fantasy-interested, science fiction fan, free-thinking audience, the college age, the senior high school age audience. And it did extremely well for those audiences as well as for the child audience. And so it helped to encourage people in Japan to keep making movies along those lines. Now, when it appeared in America, even though it appeared in a very truncated version, the original American release had about 28 minutes cut out of it, and a really appalling translation and dub. Even so, it was viewed by most American audiences as something that was completely different from any other kind of story that they had before. And it led to many, many fans in America becoming anime fans because they were so inspired by this amazing movie. And it is a wonderful movie in philosophical terms because it talks about Miyazaki's environmental values, but also about his political values. He is quite conservative in his politics, but socialist conservative, in that he respects and values old school, older values, older traditions, older social structures, but he believes in a society of opportunity and sharing for everybody. And I think if you see it in the context, ooh, wow, great scooter, I want one of those. I think if you see Kazunotani no Nausicaa in the context of Miyazaki's environmentalism and his politics side by side, it makes it a really interesting film. It's very much a statement film. And its big central statement is life is so important that sometimes it's worth dying for. But it is the only thing that's worth dying for. Politics, ideology, not really. But life, your friends, the right of everything to exist peacefully, that's worth putting your life on the line for. And it's a really powerful statement in that sense. And of course also, what many people now forget because it's been successful is it was one of the first major feature films that the West saw to make a girl an action hero. Not a heroine, absolutely an action hero. And she is not just an action hero, she's also a highly intelligent action hero. I mean, here's a girl who is pretty and cute and nurturing and sweet and all the things that a girl is expected to be in Western society. She's also a scientist who sets up her own lab to investigate things in her own way. She's also a very skilled glider pilot, and she's also an action heroine. There are not very many other heroines in children's film at the time in the West who have all those credentials stacked up. I mean, she was revolutionary, and that made her a major influence on a lot of writers and artists in the West who were looking at this and thinking, wow, why don't we do more girls like that in our comic books, in our cartoons? So she led to a great many, I think, major changes in the way people see the potential of women in art.
As well as, would you call it an environmental theme, or how would you?
I think there is a strong environmental theme because what Miyazaki is saying in the 7 Days of War and then in the attempt to revive the God Warrior is that it's much, much easier to destroy ecosystems than it is to wait the hundreds of years it takes them to grow up. And that sometimes our ideas of intervention, our ideas of the sensible thing to do, are coming from such a human-centric perspective that they're not necessarily the best thing for the environment or for us. Wow.
Also, are in general Japanese anime films more philosophical?
In general, I don't think you could necessarily argue that anime is more philosophical than Western animation. Because you have to remember, in general, the anime industry is a very big thing. And its main purpose, as with every other entertainment industry on the globe, is to sell advertising and to sell product. I mean, that's what entertainment is made for nowadays. It's made so that we will sit and watch the ads that come on before or after, or now with product placement during the movie. It's made also, obviously, film is made to mold us, to shift us, to socialize us, to get us to accept certain norms that our society believes are good. But when you look at the generality of the Japanese animation industry, it's like every other filmed entertainment medium in the world. It has a great deal of material that would stretch itself to achieve philosophical status. A lot of it is pure entertainment, lightweight, silly, sometimes vulgar, sometimes crude, very often with no content whatsoever and no purpose whatsoever, but to catch a particular fashion, a particular trend. The best of it is philosophical, as the best of everything humans make is philosophical. And very often you can find that philosophy not necessarily in the things that say, philosophical, I am important, I am serious, listen to me. You can find it embedded in films like Nausicaa, in films like Ghost in the Shell, where the philosophy is part of the story, which is generally the best way of teaching anything. I mean, ever since Homer sat down around Grecian fires and started telling stories, ever since the first caveman sat in a fire and said, let me tell you about this mammoth, the best way of imparting any philosophy has been through a really exciting story. And what I think anime does really well is because there is so much of it, because there is such a big market for anime in Japan and now in the world, it gives writers and artists an opportunity to learn how to tell those stories and how to embed those secrets and ideas and dreams in them. And through developing in that way, they can go on to make the Ghost in the Shell, the Kaze no Tani no Nausicaa, the big films or the big series of their day. But it all comes as an organic development process from the pile of mud from which everything ultimately arises.
You said that the first main audience for Astro Boy were children.
Oh yes, indeed.
Anime is obviously a super wide, broad genre, but the audience has that. Could you pinpoint an audience today for anime in general?
Again, it depends whether you're talking about Japan or another country and which other country. In the Middle East, for example, although and in a great deal of Asia, Japan is still largely for children and junior high school students. Adults tend to go on watching it if they've been fans when they're young, in just the same way as any adults do. If adults are fans of Scooby-Doo, quite a percentage of them will still be Scooby-Doo fans when they're older. If adults are fans of a particular TV show as children, quite a lot of them will watch the same kind of TV show. Same way that people who were at college or in school when Star Trek was on are still science fiction fans and watch other science fiction. So that always applies. But the mass audience is still children. In the West, the mass audience is slightly segmented in that there are a huge number of children who watch Pokemon or Digimon or shows like that and shows derived from that like Ben 10 without being aware that they're anime or anime influenced. And then there are people who watch shows that are possibly originally made for people much younger than them because they are anime fans and they want to see anything made in Japan. So, for example, you will get a show like Sailor Moon, Pretty Soldier Sailor Moon, which was originally made for 6 to 10-year-old girls in Japan and is now watched by adults of both sexes with great enthusiasm because they love anime. They weren't the intended market for the show, and there are many Japanese who would be very surprised to hear that 20-something or 30-something Western guys watch Sailor Moon. But they're still finding it interesting and getting something from it because they're anime fans. So in a sense, I suppose, you can make entertainment. As a filmmaker, as an animator, you can make it for any audience you choose, but you can't control the audience you get.
If you watch DreamWorks animated films or Pixar films or Simpsons, can you see glimpses of anime there?
I don't know. No, really, I don't know. Sometimes I will see a scene and I'll think, yeah, maybe that comes there. And of course, there's the famous scenes in Toy Story 3 where Totoro pops up from Miyazaki's film My Neighbor Totoro. Every now and then there are little homages, little nudges. The Simpsons has parodied anime on quite a number of occasions, I believe, but I'm not a massive Simpsons fan, so I couldn't pinpoint any of that specifically. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are influences there, but you need a screen-by-screen, line-by-line watch to pick them up, and it's not what I usually go to Western animation for. When I go to the cinema to watch animation, or when I turn on the TV to watch something Western, I'm doing it purely as a punter, as a viewer, and I'm there to have a good time like everybody else. Whereas when I turn on the DVD or go to the cinema or turn on the TV in Japan to watch anime, I'm working, and that means I have to take notes.
I forgot to ask you about, did you have any scene in Nausicaa that you'd like to tell us about? Was it special?
I think one of my favourite scenes in Nausicaa is the one where she and a young prince fall through the earth, through gaps in the earth, to underground caverns that are filled with pouring sand. And there she finds a wonderful revelation about how the planet is healing itself. And that's my favourite scene for one of those reasons that we were talking about earlier. That actually echoes a scene from the great James Mason version of Journey to the Centre of the Earth, where a character falls through levels in the underground caverns. Doesn't, alas, get quite the same revelation about the beauty of the earth. But if you look at the way the shots are set up, you can see Hayao Miyazaki paying homage to that wonderful sequence and using it in a totally different way. And that is, I think, one of my favourite scenes, because that shows respect for the medium of film and shows Miyazaki's awareness of film as a great director, and it also shows the characters developing beautifully, and it sums up the central philosophy of the film in that one lovely sequence, that nature will heal herself, and the best thing that we as people can do is either support her or get out of her way.
Thank you.
That it?
Thank you, Helen.
Brilliant. That was great. Is that all right for sound? Do we need to do any more bits again?
No, maybe some, if we be quiet for 30 seconds, I will take some atmosphere sound.
Okay, yeah.
So you can stay there. Okay.
This
Silence, atmosphere sound for 30 seconds, please. Thank you.
Can I ask